Angela Merkel admits her own migration policies were to blame for the Christian Democrats' stinging election defeat. Plus, racing into the US market. Formula One accepts a takeover worth billions. We'll examine the fallout from the biggest stories of the past 7 days. This is Insight Review. Hello there and welcome to Insight Review. I'll look back at the stories that have dominated the headlines for the past 7 days. Sending a clear message to Beijing. The people of Hong Kong fight for democratic governance in crucial elections for the country's parliament. And one step from extinction, how illegal hunting could soon kill off man's closest relative. We'll be talking about those stories with our guests, the journalists Martin Bentham and Arifa Akbar. But first, here's what you need to know about this week, 7 days, in 60 seconds.
Angela Merkel suffered a humiliating defeat in German regional elections as voters turned their backs on her liberal refugee policy and instead gave their support to the anti-immigrant Alternative for Germany party. Liberty Media bought Formula One motor racing in an $8 billion deal. CVC Capital Partners will hand over its ownership after taking a controlling stake in 2005. Donald Trump shared some of his military strategy if he wins the election. He said the US should work with any country that wants to defeat Daesh and that he'd favour a policy of gradual reform rather than toppling regimes. It was announced that Bill Cosby will face his accusers in court next June. More than a dozen women have accused the star of The Cosby Show of sexual assault. 350 years on, the Great Fire of London was remembered. A model of the city's 17th century skyline was lit on the River Thames to commemorate the anniversary. After 172 days on board the International Space Station, members of the US and Russian crew are back on Earth. The three-member team landed in Kazakhstan on Wednesday in a parachute capsule.
So first to Germany and that bruising defeat for Angela Merkel's party in state elections. The anti-immigration nationalist AfD party has been campaigning hard against Ms. Merkel's policies on refugees and secured 21% in the contest. It was a crushing blow for the Christian Democrats, who got 19% of the vote, putting them in third place. Well, with me in the studio to talk about this are journalists Martin Bentham and Arifa Akbar. Good to have you with us. So, Martin, a disaster for Merkel, but she has acknowledged that, hasn't she?
Yes, of course, and she could hardly do otherwise, really. It's the latest blow, I suppose, over the last year or so since the great wave of migration. She said famously, yes, we can do it. Not yes, we can, that's Barack Obama, but the same sort of phrase, we can do it, in terms of accommodating all the refugees that were coming in. And
well,
then,
Ms. Merkel said, Angela Merkel said, yeah, come here, we will welcome you.
Exactly, and it had this huge number, this great humanitarian gesture, but of course it's created enormous problems for her politically and indeed just on a practical level, and it's been causing difficulty for her in the opinion polls and in certain elections and so on since that time, and this is the most graphic illustration of that, to lose in her home state, the worst ever result that they've had there, and to be overtaken by this, the far-right AfD party, which has been really on the rise, not overwhelmingly in Germany, but achieving a significant prominence which previously that type of party just hasn't had.
And they came into second place. So does this mean that there could be a right-wing backlash, not just in Germany, but could we see this across Europe?
Aren't we already seeing it across Europe? The rise of the far right, certainly right-wing. We've sort of experienced it in Britain with Brexit, where that referendum was won to exit, largely based on immigration policy, and here we see it again. And I think the interesting thing here is that Merkel has admitted that this loss has come out of the immigration policy, but she hasn't backed down. She hasn't said,
absolutely.
And I'm
she's
going
not
to...
changing her
She's
policy,
not reversing, and she said to the Bundestag, I defend my overall thinking. She still stands by the EU agreement with Ankara, with Turkey, for immigration. I think she's in what she's doing is thinking of ways to make it more efficient so people aren't hostile to it, such as faster repatriation of asylum, people who haven't won asylum, giving bigger funds to authorities so they could accommodate asylum seekers and refugees. So I think it's quite a bold move from her to say, yes, this loss is massive and it's come out of what has happened, you know, my policy this time a year ago, but she's not backing down. And people are seeing this as a rehearsal for next year's general election.
Yes.
I think she may, I'm not predicting anything, but perhaps she can turn it around in time.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's certainly possible she can, because ultimately you've got to, you know, obviously it depends if she decides to stand herself. She hasn't yet decided, confirmed that either way. She's obviously a very strong figure with a long track record of success, which only recently, in some people's eyes, has come to be tarnished. So she's got an awful credibility and weight behind her. Obviously, depends a bit against who she's up against, because even if you have questions about person X, if the person who's contesting against them is not so good, then obviously they've got a good chance of winning. I think the other issue here is, in a way, she has actually responded, because the whole agreement with Turkey, of course, is designed to stop the flow.
And
as you say, the faster
she's desperately trying to rescue, because it's looking a bit fragile.
Exactly, the faster repatriation. So the Germans actually are trying to respond in a sense. Obviously, the part of the problem for Angela Merkel is that, you know, the people who are already there, and there's a large number, and there's still people coming. So she's trying to close the stable door a little bit after it's bolted. But as you say, broadly speaking, she's defending what she's done. She has to deal with potential further consequences of that, but I don't think it means that she's definitely going to struggle to survive.
Her popularity ratings are really low at the moment, and there is no denying that people are worried about the number of refugees coming into Germany. And then we saw those attacks as well, which rightly or wrongly have been linked to that.
And there's that legacy of those attacks in Munich, in Bavaria, and their links to Islamism. However lone wolf attacks they were, on whatever level they were lone wolf attacks, they are still attached to this idea that this is an this is a violence created by the wave of immigration. But I think that it's interesting to see this protest vote in her district, which was fairly insulated from the wave of new immigration. It's largely German. It's got a 3.7% non-German population. It doesn't have many asylum seekers. So I think the idea of this protest vote, which, you know, protest against immigration in general, not even local immigration, I think that's taking off in Europe, and we saw that again in Brexit, didn't we?
So I suppose the million-dollar question is whether her party can bounce back.
I'm sure it can. I'm sure it can, because there's quite a long time before the next year's elections, and as we know, an awful lot can happen.
More time for more refugees to arrive, though.
No, there are, but again, it all depends really on who the alternatives. Who the alternative is, or who alternatives are, and I suppose how she handles the next 12 months or so, and there's a lot to play for, I still think. Yeah.
Okay, for the moment, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, let's go next to Hong Kong, where pro-democracy parties won a significant number of seats this week in legislative polls. It's the first vote since protests began 2 years ago. Candidates in favour of greater democratic rights secured 27 seats, more than the 1/3 needed to veto major legislation. Many pro-democracy advocates accuse Beijing of trying to intimidate and interfere with voters. Some of those newly elected council members ran on a platform of greater autonomy from Hong Kong. Back to Martin and Arifa, who's still with me. And Arifa, I mean, it's fair to say these elections didn't go the way China expected. And I don't think anything like this was expected, was it?
I think it's fabulous, because we thought, and most of us thought, after the protests of 2014, all of that had died down, and that pro-democracy protests and rallies had been sort of quashed. And this shows that there was a 2.2 million voter turnout. It's a record turnout. This shows nothing's been forgotten. Pro-democracy.
It's almost like they were biding their time, weren't they? But
Exactly.
I mean, some of these guys that actually won seats were convicted, but the interesting thing was that not to jail time.
Well, one guy was very much leading the protests. He's only 23 years old. The extraordinary things about 4 of these candidates that have won seats have they're very young. They're aged from 23 to 34. This is the youth vote. I think this is the young.
Protesting against the control that China had in Hong Kong, because one of the big things they were demanding was the right to freely choose the chief executive of Hong Kong, who of course has to be approved by Beijing.
Yes, exactly, and the tensions continue clearly. And I think the problem is that from a Chinese point of view, as you said, they jail people or they convict people, but then don't jail them. And although in one level they've got tremendous force and might, and as we've seen in historical terms of real ruthless suppression if they need to, I think in Hong Kong they need to be very, very careful about going too far down that road. And so they have to tread a very delicate line, I think, between that and triggering something far more catastrophic, which would be damaging for them in world terms if they try to be very repressive. So they've got to allow these people their chance to air their views. I suppose the challenge now is they've been giving warnings since this election saying we can't have a separate Hong Kong. Nobody can be allowed to have independence. They stopped some candidates standing in this election because they advocated independence. So I suppose the tension is still going to come between what the freedom that the Hong Kong people actually voted for through
enough people to veto major legislation, that means they can really affect policy in Hong Kong. So
exactly.
You can imagine back in Beijing, the guys are sitting there going, "Oh my goodness, what on earth are we going to do?"
It's such a strong signal to Beijing, this moment, and I think it's the biggest moment since 1997. And the spirit of one country, two systems may well come into play a lot more. A number of these people that have been voted in are very pro-independence. So let's see what happens.
Do you think we're going to see more clashes between Hong Kong and Beijing then?
Well, I think that's the question, isn't it? I think it all depends how the Beijing authorities allow the expression of not full independence, but the Hong Kong legislature that's been elected now, and those younger people in it that have got this big influence there, how they allow them to exercise their voice, whether they allow some leeway to what they want and some respect for the greater freedom that they want for the Hong Kong people or not. If they try to repress that too much, then I think clearly we are going to see clashes, and that's where it gets very dangerous.
And remember in 2014, what people were protesting for was the erosion of their liberties, their freedoms, and I think they failed to get those reforms. So perhaps this is unfinished business, and we will see more protests.
Yeah, so we wait to see what happens. Thank you very much indeed for the moment. Still to come here on Insight Review, a done deal. Formula One's $1 billion takeover. Don't go away.